Vera's going to talk about her brief, and she's going to have a bit of a pitch because, as you will know, she's standing for the leadership. We've already spoken to Ed Davey, Vera, and we are about to speak next weekend. We'll be speaking to Layla Moran. So thank you very much indeed for taking the time out of your somewhat busy schedule to come and talk to the Wells members and some of their friends and some of their supporters. So that's absolutely brilliant. Off you go.
Well, thank you for having me. And I assure you, this is my favorite bit of the day because currently being in the House of Commons is very tedious. And I love to talk to friends and colleagues, particularly in the Southwest, because this is now my political home. And I know many of you, and maybe some of you have actually been at the regional conference in February in Tiverton, where I actually launched my leadership. That seems to be an absolute age ago in the old days pre-COVID. And we are now used to a completely different world of zooming in and out of things. I have actually been from the seat here in my London flat because I had to return to London last week for a physical parliament. So from my chair in London, I have actually been visiting the Wirral, Wales, Sheffield, Bristol, and now you guys. So, you know, I've been around the country already quite a lot, and it's an absolute pleasure. And also it seems a much better way of getting around more people than actually physical meetings are. And that's quite an interesting learning, as quite a lot of things are from our COVID experience. So there's some positive things that we can think about, and surely when it comes to the environment, there are actually lots of positive things that we have experienced in the last few weeks, and that is particularly around clean air, appreciating the environment again, much safer walking particularly, and cycling for those who do it. People have found ways of not traveling by car. These are sort of advantages that I'm sure we can talk about. Much more local food sourcing and eating. People have rediscovered how to make bread, one of the big COVID discoveries. So there are actually things that have made also life better, not easier, but it seems better as we've come back to basics. But of course, there's also many, many things that have made life very difficult for probably all of us. But it's good to see you all in good spirits on Zoom. So about my climate brief, I was involved in developing the climate policy that is now Lib Dem policy, which we adopted at the last autumn conference, which was developed actually over 2 years. And there are a few headlines about how we tackle the climate emergency. The first thing is we will tackle most emissions by 2030 and we'll get to net zero by 2045. And I really encourage everybody to go onto the Lib Dem website and go through the different functions and find our climate policy. It is an 80-page document, but it's very readable and you can pick out the sections that you want to read. So how are we going to get to net zero by 2045? One of the biggest polluters or the biggest contributors to the carbon emissions in the atmosphere is surface transport, and it's one of the sectors where we have done the least. So we need to make sure that very quickly we transition from our current way of transport into a net zero future. And it can be done, like everything about tackling the climate emergency, it can be done, it needs political will. It needs mainly a political will from government to switch to alternative forms of fuels. And that is for our big vehicles, that is lorries, but that's also trains and buses probably switching to hydrogen. And it is for private car travel, it's electric cars. It is also about providing much more alternatives to individual car travel and making sure that we have many more cycling and walking opportunities. And all of that can be done if their central government particularly prepared to also devolve a lot of decision-making powers to local council in order to make this happen. And we can possibly talk about the difficulties that local councils face if you're a councillor of making some of these changes happen. So that's the transport sector. The next sector is a big contributor to the carbon emissions are our homes. We've got a policy about new homes. We want to make sure that net zero homes all net zero homes are built by 2021. That's only a year away. And then what is called passive house standard by 2025. That's about planning law and planning regulations. And again, quite a lot of that then falls back to local authorities, and there will be lots of people who say, well, we would like to do this, but, and there again, it is about central government being on board and making these changes to planning law. But again, it can be done. The sector is ready to do it. The latest consultation that government has led has actually had a reaction from a lot of people saying the government is still concentrating too much on renewable energy and heating rather than looking at the fabric of the building. And any of you being experts here, I'm sure we might have a discussion about how do we make sure that actually the fabrics of our home are ready for a net zero future, and government knows what to do and how to regulate them. And then we come to the more difficult sectors, and that is agriculture. And again, I'm talking to lots of people from rural areas, so I'm sure we'll have a good discussion about how do we actually make agriculture net zero. Most live and living things produce carbon emissions, particularly through methane. So what can we do in order to get these to net zero or mitigate or create negative emissions? And there again, we've got a big program for negative emissions. We know that nature itself can actually take a lot of carbon emissions out of the atmosphere, and that is through tree planting, but it's also through rewilding, peat bogs and wetlands, and the creation of those. But then there's also a very complicated technology called negative emissions technology, and that is actively taking carbon emissions out of the atmosphere and storing them into carbon capture storage in bedrock, in seabed rocks, and so on and so forth. And then one last sector, and that is why Lib Dems have set this rather more cautious target of 2045. Is aviation. Nobody could predict COVID and the massive reduction in aviation and travel that we are currently facing. And maybe that actually leads to the fact that we can bring our target forward. But aviation was particularly one of the sectors why we Lib Dems have said we can probably realistically only get to net zero at 2045, because unlike the Greens, we don't say we must stop flying around the world. Flying is obviously a form of transport that has created a global world, and this is unlikely that it will stop entirely. The question is not flying. The question is the fuels with which on which aeroplanes fly. So how can we make sure that actually the fossil fuels that currently power our planes are being replaced by synthetic fuels? And the blending of synthetic fuels is something that government can actually easily regulate for now for internal flights, and can be done today, tomorrow. It needs political will, and then further on we need to have obviously international agreements. But there are mechanisms for all of this. Everything can be done. Lord Deben has said the interesting thing about the climate emergency and tackling the climate emergency, it is something that we know how to do it. It just needs the will to do it and set the targets and get on with it. I leave this here, and I'm happy to take questions, and I'm looking forward to the session.
Thank you very much indeed. Brilliant. Lovely. Okay, so the first question is from Sadie, who's on the call, and it's, how can the party improve on its mental health campaigning in areas such as the lack of acute inpatient beds in short stay units? And also, how can it improve in helping its members who struggle with mental health issues themselves?
Oh, it's a good question. It's not on the environment, but it's on one of the questions where we Liberal Democrats have actually been leading the debate to make sure that mental health gets a parity with physical health. Indeed, I myself, when I can talk more or less competently on health issues, it's much more around mental health issues than around physical health issues. So the main thing continues to be on making sure that we all as society understand the stigma that is still around mental health, and thereon the problems to get adequate funding into the sector. So many more people are doing it now, and it's obviously led with high-profile people like the Duchess, the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, that people talk about their mental health and seek help. That's the first step. But it is also true that for many people, particularly probably an older generation, they feel more inhibited to talk about mental health. But the identification of what is mental health is the first step to making progress. And then it follows on the funding, and that's obviously where we're talking about mental health beds. Whenever we run into issues about mental health, it is about funding. And a lot of that is to do that mental health is much better dealt with when you prevent it rather than when you're trying to cure it. And there the government, but the whole of our political thinking is always focused on curing something, and actually we would spend our money so much better if we went into prevention of mental health issues. And the funding of beds and hospital beds, the whole of the funding issues about the NHS keeps coming back at us anyway. It is massively underfunded. Liberal Democrats have talked about a penny in the pound of income tax. I suggest it probably would have to be a lot more if you look at the overall funding problems that the NHS has, and then always make sure that this extra funding doesn't go into physical health, tackling physical health, but mental health problems. And that can only be done by people campaigning and campaigning and campaigning about it. I'm the chair of the eating disorder APPG, which is a mental health disorder, and I run always into the same problem, that people don't understand that spending the money at the beginning is so much better than spending it later on when people are acutely ill, and it takes a very long time, and some people never get better.
Okay.
Oh, and about our party, I mean, same thing. I think it is okay to say that you're not okay. I think that's quite a good slogan. Let people know that you're not okay. And the discussion that we have within the party about mental health issues also needs to just have a much higher profile.
I'm eating my supper. Bother.
Right, sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. Okay. Matt Martin, who I didn't see on the call earlier, but maybe he's joined us since. In light of the recent suggestion that any trade deal with the US would force our hand to introduce animal products into the UK that have been subject to lower welfare, hygiene, and production standards than we would expect in Europe, how would an effective opposition, possibly led by the Lib Dems, push back against a Conservative government to maintain both our food supply standards and protect the British agricultural sector?
Of course, the temptation is high to go back to the battles that we had during the Brexit debate and reopen the debate why it's been so foolish to leave the European Union. Not just because I think we are losing out, I think the European Union is losing out. We were champions for food standards and particularly animal welfare. And I'm sure the guys in Europe, they're going to miss out on a strong UK campaigning force on these issues. But the fact that we have now left the European Union can obviously easily lead to the fact that we are dropping our own standards simply because we are in such a need of finding other trading partners like the US in order to make up for lost trade. I've just seen yesterday a letter from Eustace and the other. What's the minister, never mind, 2 ministers from the government who have reassured us that they would never drop our food safety standards and our animal welfare standards. But this government is incredibly good at talking the talk but not walking the walk. So what can we do as an effective opposition? Just you have to be incredibly vigilant where the government is going back on its promises, and make sure that when it comes to these trade negotiations, that we look over this and never leave an opportunity to point out where the government is going back on its promises. And to be quite honest, people power works. You know, there's lots of people who have written in. There's now a petition from the NFU about food standards, which I just signed. It is about, you know, never letting up campaigning. And we opposition MPs, indeed any MP, is only ever as good as the people behind them. So I come from a campaigning background. I would encourage every Lib Dem who feels strongly about it to not let up, to keep writing to their MPs. In the same way as people have written in over Brexit in the last 2.5 years, this is going to be a massive issue. It's going to happen. I fear that we are going to drop our standards, but with hopefully with pressure from the grassroots and us Liberal Democrats then emboldened by this grassroots movement behind us, we will make sure that the government won't get away with it.
Thank you. We know that this is from Rosemary Hasler, who is our president, who is on the call. She says, we know that you're a passionate environmental campaigner, but if you were able to introduce a private member's bill in some other area, what would you choose and why?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Obviously, I became known with my private members bill on upskirting. Now, private members bills are a particularly British thing, and in fact, a very good thing. It's normally legislative initiatives come from the government. You know, political parties set out a manifesto, and if they then get into government, they are introducing through, as we all know, through the Queen's speech, their legislative program. And usually those are big pieces of legislation. And then there are private members who are backbenchers who bring in a little pieces of legislation that are not the big government acts, but the sort of small pieces of legislation that often mean just as a change in existing law that would make a big difference. Like the Upskirting Bill, I hope would do, and actually it did make a difference, but it's only a small piece of legislation. So, and very, very few initiatives, very few of these private members' bills ever see the light of day. And this is why it was so significant that my Upskirting Bill got through, because it was actually very unusual, but it only got through because actually the government took it on as part of their own, into their own statute book. Otherwise, I wouldn't have got it through either. So it is always about cross-party working. Now, I have campaigned on a number of these sort of smaller issues. For example, on a campaign that's attached to the Istanbul Convention. So I've to make it mandatory that we have got enough rape support centres for women who have been raped, because currently the waiting lists are absolutely enormous, and the trauma that women suffer when they have been raped, and the help that they need, and indeed the issues that they then face with their mental health could be greatly reduced if we had more support, and if we had a government committed to the right number of support centres for women who've been raped. So that would be one of the legislative initiatives that I'm keen on. I've been campaigning on sex for rent. I'm not entirely sure how I want to tackle that, but sex for rent, a vile practice that is widespread, that can probably only be addressed through an amendment in the Housing Act. So I've taken up a lot of these slightly more hidden issues that don't make necessarily immediately the big headlines, but that cause enormous suffering, that are there, that are vile practices, that are often related to sexual offences. So that's probably where I would focus my energy on. I have focused my energy on childhood trauma and the prevention of adverse childhood experiences. I don't have a private members bill for that yet. But that would be, those are the sort of issues that I'm particularly keen on for private members' bills. But if it came for the environment, then I would do the big stuff. But I need to be in government for that.
Thank you. Martin Dunton, who is on the call, says, please give us an example of how and when you have applied the level of assertiveness that will be required to put the PM in his place at the ballot box, getting media recognition for doing so.
Can you ask that question again?
Yes.
Do you want me to step in, Tessa?
Is that Mark?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Hi, Wera. I'm a relatively new member here, and I think that the one thing that sort of jumped out is that the Lib Dems historically haven't really, in my opinion, taken the opportunity to really attack the government on their record. So what I'm looking for in a candidate is somebody who can demonstrate that they have that ability to hold government to account and get the recognition for doing so. So within your background, whether it be political or otherwise, I'm just quite interested as to whether you've had any situations where you've really had to go for the throat, metaphorically speaking.
Right. So, Mark, thank you for that question. Actually, it's a little bit my own fault that we haven't talked about the leadership yet, because I suggested to Tessa that first we are talking about my brief as the environment spokesperson and the climate change spokesperson, and we are asking questions around that theme. And then we would have a second stint in which I would talk about my leadership bid. Tessa, do you think it's time that I talk about my leadership bid now?
I didn't select the order of questions, Wera, so I'll go with whatever you want to do.
Yes, okay. If you could, that'd be good.
Right. So now to my leadership bid, Wera Hobhouse, New Direction, Fresh Inspiration, as I'm calling it. The reason why I stand for leadership is because, first of all, I think we need a clear break from the coalition government. And I'm saying that because I was myself surprised how much the coalition government and all the issues around the last 10 years have been following us around into the 2019 election. And I think it is really time that we break with the coalition government in personality, but also in direction. And by this, I mean, we need to defeat the Tories, not by being like the Tories or not by pretending that we are somewhere in the middle. I believe the Liberal Democrats come with their hearts and minds firmly from the centre-left camp, and the legacy of Paddy Ashdown and Charlie Kennedy when we were doing well as the Liberal Democrats, when we were clearly a centre-left party. And we've sort of abandoned that the coalition years. And there are many good reasons, and I don't want to put the blame on the people who were in the coalition government. I was the person who was there in 2010 who voted for the coalition government at Birmingham Conference. But I think we have to recognize that the legacy of that coalition government was the most right-wing government that we have seen in history, the brutal attack on our welfare state. We've now left the European Union, and that is where really the last 10 years have taken us. And we have to take some sort of responsibility for that, at least recognizing, of course, through hindsight, that we need to go into a direction where we as Liberal Democrats can recreate our political fortunes. And I think that is from the centre left, because that's where our heart beats. We are believing into a world of global justice. We believe that everybody, not just in this country, has the right to a good life. And I believe we have sort of slightly lost focus of our very clear centre-left instincts and attitudes towards the climate change, towards housing, towards international human rights, and so on and so forth. And I think we can only do that with both our feet in a centre-left party and to build a progressive alliance. Now, my pitch has already been out there. People are discussing it on Lib Dem Voice, and I'm taking, all the arguments against it, and I'm happy to discuss this tonight with you as well. But this is one of the main pillars of my pitch. The other pillars of my pitch is that I am the only one of the candidates who's actually been for 10 years in local government. I've been a councillor for 10 years. We took control of Rochdale Council in the Northwest in 2006 and ran it until 2010. It was a metropolitan borough council. And I passionately believe in the force of local government and local decision making. And I believe actually our political fortunes have to come back from building from the grassroots. And the recent election wash-up that has been read and acknowledged by everybody has clearly stated that we do not win national seats unless we've prepared the grassroots and have one on the ground. And therefore we need to rebuild our local bases, our local activists, as many local councils as we can to get re-elected into local councils, whether that's district council or even parish council, or metropolitan borough council, city council, or county councils. So I believe that's the direction where we need to go, build from the grassroots, recognize the strength that we have as local government representatives, as firm believers in local democracy and local decision making. And I think having lived through local government and understood the importance of local government, I can probably best see that through if I was the leader of the party. And the other thing is, I'm now in the Southwest, but I've just mentioned I've been doing politics in the Northwest. I think it is important to have people who actually understand different areas of the country, and again understand the different local demands, and that one size doesn't fit all. And how do we deal with the fact that we want to have an overarching central message, but how can we tailor that then and give local communities, local government, local councillors, local campaigners the resources and the power to form their own messages? I think that is one of my very important messages in this leadership campaign. And then the last one that I keep saying, I'm a hard liberal. I don't ultimately believe in compromises. Yes, I think we need to work together, of course, and we need to heal divisions where they exist, but we cannot meet intolerance with tolerance. And I've learned that the hard way when a very long time ago, I was a student campaigner in where I grew up in Germany, in West Germany. You know, we were fighting the communists, and you don't fight intolerance with tolerance. Obviously you don't want to become a police state. You don't want to become as intolerant as the intolerance that you meet. But you must be uncompromising and saying that you need to defeat that, rather than sort of thinking that maybe you can work together, or maybe you can achieve this, that, and the other by working together. No, I've read a book. Many people have heard about it. From Karl Popper, The Open Society and Its Enemies. We are in this phase again where the open society is clearly threatened, and this time it's not threatened by the communists. This time it's threatened by the right wing, and I'm worried about the open society, and we need to fight it, and we need to be tough on it. That's my pitch. Happy to answer more questions. What was it, Mark? Oh, how I could become more assertive? I would say, just don't try to defeat the Tories by being like the Tories. We have to clearly differentiate ourselves in what we stand for, in our values, in how we approach things, how we approach local government, how we tackle the climate emergency, the issues that we take on and find important. Those are the issues on which we Liberal Democrats are good on. We need to be proud of what we have historically stand for and where we come from. We need to be proud of our campaigning abilities and build from the local level up.
Thank you, Vera. I think I'm going to press you on the first part of Martin's question, and that was that he wanted an example of when you'd applied the level of assertiveness that was required. So can you think of an example, or do you want to think about that as the meeting goes?
I mean, I know for the Southwest, this is a bit of a sore issue. But I, from Bath and my Bath community, have been a passionate anti-Brexit campaigner. And I know that was a particularly difficult message for the Southwest. But I also believe, because in Bath, fair enough, a good breeding ground for the global citizens who care about Europe and our membership. But also, I was out there 2 days after the referendum result on the 25th of June 2016, and said, I'm not going to take that lying down. And I founded Bath for Europe. I created that movement around us in Bath. We became leaders of a whole movement. We ended up with movements across the city, across the country, that were anti-Brexit movements and for Europe movements, be that Bristol for Europe, or Bath for Europe, or Manchester for Europe. We ultimately brought 1 million people out on the streets of London to protest. That's the sort of stuff that we need to deliver. Yes, we didn't in the end get the result that we wanted, but it brought us back into the debate as Liberal Democrats. 20% of support last year. We got 16 MEPs elected in the European elections, and we made big progress in the local elections because people recognize us for the tough people and the tough campaigners that we were. And I feel that I was very much part of that resistance.
Thank you.
And I would do the same for the climate emergency. I tell you that. I'm not just a one-trick pony. Now Brexit, we have left the European Union, it's done. But there are other issues on which we can be as uncompromising and as tough as I've been on fighting Brexit. Acknowledge where battles have been fought and currently lost, but go to the next thing and fight as passionately and vigorously as I feel I fought on leaving the European Union.
Thank you, Vera. Talking about demonstrations, I'm just going to move to a question that's related on a different subject. So Theo Butt-Phillip, who popped into the picture with his daughter, asks, should there be a police investigation into the actions of the protesters who removed the Edward Colston statue and threw it into the docks in Bristol yesterday? And if there is the evidence to support it, should they be prosecuted?
So first of all, should there be? There will be. Trust me, I've just been in a statement with Priti Patel, and that's what they're going to do. Now you're going to ask me whether I support that. First of all, of course, no elected politician that believes in the rule of law can support any sort of vandalism and public order offences. But then you obviously have to look at the motivation, why people have done what they have, and the hurt and the passion behind the demonstrations. And clearly, we and the US look at ourselves as a country that sort of is dealing with racism, and clearly we haven't done enough in order to make sure that our ethnic minority communities, and in this case particularly the Black minority groups, and the vast numbers of people from Black communities think that we are serious about it. And there is the outpouring of anger and frustration that we have seen in the last few days. And most protests have been peaceful, and that's good. And there's always there's the few people who are overstepping the mark, are undermining the peaceful protest. On Edward Colston, the big question is, of course, why was the statue still there? When I believe, people say, yeah, there should have been democratic processes in which this should be dealt with. But clearly the democratic processes in the last 10 years at least have failed to get the result where most people would now agree and say, look, that we are celebrating somebody who's clearly one of the most vile representatives of a vile trade. Yes, he's also been a benefactor. I mean, we are all reading about Edward Colston, and yes, he was, this bizarre person who, on the back of a huge amount of suffering, has also done a lot for charity, and it is very difficult to put the two together. But yes, we should have, certainly the council, but the whole of the attitude in this country towards statues and who do we celebrate, we should have made more progress in the past. And it is very unfortunate what has happened in Bristol. I don't condone public order offences and vandalism. But, we should all look down our own noses and say, why did this happen? And I think, yes, people need to obviously be brought to justice, but I think we shouldn't be heavy-handed at all, because look at what happened in the United States, where Donald Trump and the right wing has responded so heavy-handedly. It will only create further divisions. We need to make sure that we have people on our side for that the law works for them, and that we are basing our country on laws and on rules-based society that works for everybody, not just for a privileged white class. So our Black communities, our ethnic minority communities, if we want them to abide by the law, we need to make sure that they feel the law of this land is actually applying to them as well. So I think it should be handled very, very sensitively. I do believe, of course, there needs to be some sort of investigation who was responsible and what happened. But I think in this case, it would probably be wise not to escalate the situation by very heavy-handed prosecutions.
Thank you. I think that probably gives, I can ask the second part of Theo's question, which is probably a yes-no answer, and it's related. Will you take a position publicly saying that we should not waste valuable resources investigating and prosecuting these people?
Oh, absolutely. I've been in the chamber today. I asked one very simple question to Priti Patel about whether she thinks the statue should have been removed a long time ago. And she didn't answer the question. I mean, that's obviously what government ministers are very good at. They just don't answer the question. But it is about, asking and continuing to ask the pertinent and uncomfortable question to those in power. MP stands for most persistent. I won't give up, trust me.
Don't suppose anybody thinks you will. Thank you very much indeed. Related to that, Anthony Vaughan, who is on the call, asks, given the current events around Black Lives Matter, we have to acknowledge the lack of representation, not only in the Lib Dems, but also in politics, both nationally and locally. What practical things do you propose we do to improve representation amongst the Black and minority groups?
So we have, it's a very good question, and we have done a lot of soul searching within the Lib Dems around diversity and how diverse we are as a party. We have actually made good progress, particularly when it comes to representation of women, but we have made less good progress when it comes to representation of ethnic minorities, although we've got Munira Wilson in Parliament now, and we've got Layla with a half Palestinian background. And if I may say, I consider myself, apart from being a woman, also as a diverse candidate, because after all, I'm first generation migrant, okay, from the European Union. I'm white, but I'm also different. And in fact, I'm more different than most members of Parliament. I'm, apart from one American MP now, I'm the only MP who's not been born with a British passport. So I do actually think that the party, and in Bath and across the party, we are trying to look at diversity and getting different, as diverse numbers of people elected. But we haven't made enough progress, certainly not when it comes to disability, and certainly not when it comes to ethnic diversity. And how can we tackle that? I mean, to be quite honest, we've never quite crunched the issue of all women shortlists, and we've been quite careful as Liberal Democrats because we don't see shortlists as particularly liberal. But all women shortlists, but we could introduce all ethnic minority shortlists. It's not beyond imagination to do something like this if we really wanted to force the issue. And of course, a lot of people say, oh, look at Parliament now. Gradually we will become more representative, and we as a party will gradually become more representative. But if you want to force a change of pace, you sometimes have to sort of go that little bit further and introduce certain things that are not necessarily seen as particularly liberal from a liberal point of view. But then there's always a balance about what is more important. And if it's really important for us to become more diverse, I think we just have to bite the bullet as liberals and introduce some measures that make sure that we are as diverse as we should be. And shortlist is one of the ways of doing those sort of things, if we wanted to.
Thank you. Thank you. Right. I'm just going to give you, there's 4 quick fire questions here. So they're kind of yes and no type answers. So are you for or against a land tax?
Yes, and I think we have to definitely have to rethink how and what we tax in this country. So currently we are taxing income, but should we tax wealth? And I think we should tax wealth. How exactly we are going to do that is a big question. I know the way we Lib Dems like to do policies is by putting together a working party that mills over it for 2 years and then comes out with a recommendation. That's sometimes quite a slow way of doing it. It also has its advantages because when we put something out there, like for example our climate policy, it's very, very, very thought through, and a lot of people have inputted into it. I think it is time that we look again at this issue about what do we actually want to tax, wealth or income. I think we should start to look at taxing wealth.
Thank you. Are you for or against scrapping Trident?
Ah, good one. I have to say that the idea about a nuclear deterrent works, and it's an absurd sort of mental gymnastics. But if you look at the history of nuclear deterrent in the last, 70 years since the nuclear bomb was dropped, there's only once a nuclear or 2 nuclear bombs were dropped, and that is when only one power knew how to develop nuclear weapons. And since we have the idea about a nuclear deterrent, although there were many very, very close encounters, no nuclear bombs have since been dropped. I know it's a very difficult and emotionally bizarre argument, but I have to admit that a nuclear deterrent works. Can we replace Trident with something better and more effective? I don't know.
Okay. Are you for or against an elected House of Lords?
Oh, I'm for an elected House. Well, I'm for an elected second chamber.
Okay. And what is the best way to encourage green planning within our national housing and office buildings programmes?
Well, what's the best way of doing that? We need to have changes at government level on planning laws. And then you go into the details of which of those are particularly relevant to the issue that has just been raised. But the thing is, we are one of the most centralized countries in the Western world. A lot of what we do is regulated through central government, and in fact this Tory government is taking more and more powers away from local authorities. So the devolution back of resources and power and decision making to local authorities is one of the best ways of doing that.
Good. Thank you. That's the end of the quick fire. Now I'm going to go to Sue Harvey, who is on the call. Do you think there's a case for opposing the government's plans to build large new hospitals when what is badly needed are smaller local convalescent units to which patients can be transferred for assessment, thereby releasing expensive beds in specialist hospitals?
I think the biggest issue, not just now, but over at least the last decade, is that we don't release people quickly enough from hospital back into the community, be that either into suitably adapted homes or into social care settings that are suitable. So I think the biggest issue is how we organize our adult social care system, and particularly how we do that for the elderly. And the COVID crisis has absolutely shown that problem. In fact, the hospitals this time round with COVID were amazingly empty. So actually, the hospital beds themselves are probably not the issue. The issue is the blocking, because we don't release people who can be released from hospital and acute treatment into social care settings particularly, and that is the elderly. And unless we put more money into the system, and that is adult social care, we will not resolve the issue. But you know, whether that be then sort of community beds, that's one way of doing it. But the whole thing doesn't work with extra resources into the system. And every government in the book has avoided this painful question. And with it, related to it, is how are we going to finance that? How do we as a society finance our health and social care system? How do we finance our old age? And I hear it time and again, on the doorstep is I've paid into the system all my life. Yes, people have paid into the system on a very old basis, where basically you survive your retirement for 5 or 10 years. We are now surviving our retirement for 20 or 30 years. And there's a massive gap, which basically means that after 10 years, you've spent all the money that you've paid in during your working life, and the rest of the 20 years that you still live, and that's great, you know, we all live longer, is not being paid for. So we got to have a big discussion about how we are going to pay for that. All of us.
Thank you. I'll move now to Nick McGurr's question. Nick asks, does your new direction for Liberal Democrats also include a new direction for people? For you to be a people person and be known to be speaking for the people, the spokesperson in Parliament for people's values. And he's put in brackets, the preamble to the Liberal Democrat Constitution has in every part of it the principles and good effects of having a government of principles and of value to the people.
I love that question. And I would say from sitting here, absolutely. And I loved a Lib Dem slogan from years and years ago, that we trust in people. But our preamble also clearly says, we believe that everybody, every person on this earth has the right to live a good life, free from fear of persecution, fear from financial worries, fear from not being able to put a roof over their heads, free from violence, and so on and so forth. So absolutely, to be a party and see politics ultimately, that is something for people. Everything has to be for people. The economy has to work for people, and it has to work for all people, not just for a particular group of people. Yes, absolutely. I would love to be a leader that is a leader for people.
Good, thank you. So the next one is Jeff Baker-Hitch, who I'm not sure is on the call. I think not. He asks, what does Wera and the other leadership candidates, well, you're not going to answer that, are you? What does Wera think about a formal merger with the Labour Party before the next general election?
I think we shouldn't merge with the Labour Party, because we are not the Labour Party. We are clearly distinct from them. But I do believe that we need to work more closely with the Labour Party in order to defeat the Tories at the next general election. And as I said already, we don't defeat the Tories by becoming like the Tories. We defeat the Tories by being clearly distinct from them. But we're also not the Labour Party. And if I say I believe in a progressive alliance, and we Liberal Democrats should stand with both our feet firmly in the centre-left, rather than sort of hovering between the right and the left. I don't mean that we should become the Labour Party, but we should also not be afraid to carve a very big space out for ourselves on the progressive left, because yeah, we believe in civil liberties. We don't believe ultimately in the authoritarian tendencies of the Labour Party. I've said already, we believe passionately in grassroots politics, and the Labour Party doesn't really do that. They're far more sort of centralized. There are so many reasons why we are not like the Labour Party. And therefore, I don't believe we should become the Labour Party. We are different. We come from very different traditions. We have very different ways of operating. And it's important that we, with the Labour Party, ultimately need to fight for electoral reform, so that each party in this country actually gets proportionately represented in Parliament. But no, never a merger with the Labour Party. I'm not a Labour Party member, and I don't want to be one.
Okay, fine. And that's connected with a question that's coming from Peter Lawrence, who is on the call. And he said, Johnson and the Tory party appear to be on a downward trend over the mishandling of COVID. How can we ensure this trend continues? How will you work with other parties? Is there any hope to introduce proportional representation into our electoral system?
So there's two questions there. One is about COVID and one is about proportional representation. I have been, actually I joined the Electoral Reform Society in 2015, and then was also on the Council for the Electoral Reform Society. I passionately believe in electoral reform, and I actually think, sadly, not delivering proportional or a voting reform by the coalition government is one of the biggest failures, if I may say that, about the leadership of the coalition at the time. Again, as I say, I supported the coalition government. I sat it out there in the north. We lost every election between 2010 and 2015, and the one prize could have been proportional representation, and we didn't get it. That was disappointing. We need proportional representation. How do we deliver that? By making sure that we actually get a manifesto commitment of every party that are not the Tories, because the Tories will just not put it into their manifesto. But we are on a path to put voting reform into manifestos of the Labour Party, the Green Party, the Liberal Democrats, and for me, that would be a red line for any working together. Because if we don't get proportional representation, we'll continue to be here for generations, continuously being squeezed out and having to answer questions. Why don't we become the Labour Party? Because we are not the Labour Party. We are a different party, but we struggle in a system that is set up for only one of two parties to succeed. So that's about proportional representation. Get it into the manifestos. Make sure that the Labour Party understands that they don't win without us, which they won't, and the Green Party's on board anyway. About COVID, we have been calling now for a judge-led inquiry about the handling of the COVID crisis. It becomes more and more obvious that the government made massive mistakes, particularly, and I've been saying that from the beginning, by not locking down earlier. That could have saved thousands of lives. It showed an arrogance of the leadership, sort of buoyed probably by their Brexit success, that they could sort of do this on their own and fight COVID on their own, without understanding that the COVID virus would not behave differently only because it had landed in Britain. And here we are, and call out the failures, be absolutely ruthless now, and making sure that we are not silent on the things where the government has gone wrong, and has gone wrong because it's a right-wing government. It based a lot of its responses to COVID on the herd immunity, a sort of survival of the fittest argument, where a few elderly, or some thousands of elderly and the vulnerable could be sacrificed in order to save the economy. And exactly because the economy was seen as something separate from the people. The economy is something that has to serve the people, not the other way around. We needed to save lives, and the government was far too slow to lock down Britain to save the economy, and now they are probably in the worst position of all countries in Europe. And if we are not very, very careful, we are getting into a second peak, and then somebody help us.
Thank you. Connected with that, there's a question again from Martin, or a comment and a question from Martin, who says, I'm not sure we can just say the NHS needs more money. I don't think we know that. So would we support a cross-party review of what NHS strategy and funding levels should be, so we can stop using the NHS funding as a political football?
Yes, I know a lot of people obviously say it's not about, you can throw all the money of the world at it, and it might still not deliver the results. Look, the Liberal Democrats have been calling for a national commission, or a health commission, cross-party working on the issue for at least 10 years now or longer, and it's not going to happen. So of course, I'm happy to call for cross-party working and taking it out of the political arena altogether. But then it doesn't recognize that the way you tackle a problem is informed by where you come from politically. And if you believe in good public services, then you would tackle the whole issue differently, as if you believe in privatizing everything, or a market mechanism to address everything. And if you look at the widespread support that we have seen, and the clapping for healthcare workers, and particularly the NHS is a national treasure because it's a public service. And you know, any health commission that we create cross-party would only get mired in the issue of whether we should privatize more or less, when really, I believe it should be a very good functioning public service, and we need to think about how we fund it. And yes, of course, we shouldn't waste money, But we Liberal Democrats and progressive parties will probably approach the issue in a completely different way from the Tories, who just don't believe in good public services. And therefore, it is a bridge that's very difficult it's a gap that's very difficult to bridge. So let's work with the parties that are with us on believing in good public services, and not waste our time with a party that I believe will never come round to actually wanting to preserve a good public service like the NHS.
Thank you. Ganesh asks, he's on the call, and he asks, when the press says capitalism is an essential component of liberalism, what do you say?
So I say, as a liberal, I believe in enterprise and business, and I believe in the market. I'm not a socialist, and therefore also I wouldn't become a member of the Labour Party. I believe in functioning market mechanisms, but I believe in very well-regulated markets, and that's where the state intervenes, and that's where I'm very different from the Tories. And I think that's where liberalism sits. We believe in markets, we believe in enterprise, we believe in the power of new ideas, creativity, all of what enterprise and business can provide. But we also believe that the state needs to intervene to regulate the biggest excesses of the markets and big businesses that become too big. And that is, I think, a very good position to be in as a liberal.
Good, thank you. Last few. Garfield asks, where can we apply influence to reform our broken parliamentary democracy? Is there any way to stop the Punch and Judy, left and right simplistic split that is our current system in a tired old building dripping with pointless public school practices, supported by a press owned by expat billionaires?
Wow.
No emotion in that question.
Very good. Where can we start? I've said it already. I think we started by rebuilding a very solid local government base. And basically, we got to defeat the Tories, who believe in all of that rubbish that has just been sort of listed in a very punchy way. And then part of it is definitely electoral reform. It embeds the combative Punch and Judy, as you just said, environment where we are celebrating the winner takes it all culture, rather than understanding that a lot of good politics actually comes from a consensus. And I've said in my early pitch that there are obviously lines for me, and that is where politics become intolerant, and you have to draw a line somewhere at extreme intolerance. But otherwise, across a tolerant spectrum of political parties and ideas that respects the rule of law, and that respects parliamentary democracy, that respects the right of minorities and civil liberties. On that spectrum of political parties, we need to work together, but only a decent voting system will actually bring that about. While we are stuck in a polarized system of Punch and Judy, we cannot deliver that grown-up politics. So it's got to be about fighting for electoral reform.
Probably beating Jacob Rees-Mogg would help.
We tried, and you know what? We can beat him if the Progressive Alliance fights combined against him. We were splitting the vote in the last election, and I know North East Somerset as a seat was actually, in the end, I think he also got a 50% majority. And I know that was the difficulty in the last general election. But we put ourselves into good second places again, and in the Southwest, clearly we are second against the Tories, and we need to have this informal pact with the Labour Party where we are not fighting the Labour Party, and the Labour Party doesn't fight us at the last general election. I think we've all learned a big lesson here, and North East Somerset was definitely one of them.
Yeah. Okay, which leads us on. Bruce Hunt asks, how can we win over Tory voters in areas such as rural Southwest, whilst remaining passionately pro-EU?
I think I've been in a Zoom meeting with Bath for Europe, and everybody is bruised, absolutely. about a colossal defeat about what we were standing for, and so was I. I mean, I won my seat in Bath, but trust me, I would have happily given a few thousands of my votes away in order to make sure that we win in other seats and have more MPs in Parliament. And the massive majority that the Tories got have made me very, very depressed for a long time. And I'm still living through that slight trauma, but here we are. What can we do? We have to remember why we fought for the European Union, not because the European countries are such a wonderful bunch, but because it comes from our internationalism and our belief in international cooperation. And also our pragmatism, that we've understood that actually working together and our deeply embedded links with everything, it's not just about trade, that's about university and your research cooperation, that's about data sharing, that's about Copernicus. I mean, we are so interlinked, it's very difficult to see how we are going to detach ourselves in the end. But what is it that where we can get people with their hearts and minds, and that is to point to the human suffering of Brexit, and that is enormous. More and more stories that I hear about families that I have to separate, people who are feeling very much in limbo. If you talk about the EU citizens, the group of millions of EU citizens who are feeling incredibly vulnerable, hurt, feeling that they're the next Windrush generation, they're the next lot of people whose human suffering we haven't measured, and this government certainly hasn't measured. So talking about that particularly, and like somebody said earlier, talk about people rather than talking about trade deals. I think that is something that we absolutely need to do. And then I think farmers will probably feel that the government is going to let them down. I think fishing communities will probably discover that the government is letting them down. A lot of things that Boris Johnson has promised is not going to materialize. So be up there, be very vigilant, where the government is actually rowing back on their promises and letting people down. And I'm sure that will happen. We can sort of let the whole thing play itself out on Europe, I think, but point particularly to the human suffering. That's something that's very acute, that's very alive, that's now. Brexit will play itself out in this shambolic thing that is going to be. I'm quite patient, and I'm quite happy to sit back for a year or so and then jump in and say, look, that's because it's a government that has promised you the earth and has delivered nothing.
Sure. For the benefit of everybody on the call, what's the size of your majority?
Oh, it's a bit over 12,000, isn't it? 12,600. But as I say, I'm happily sharing that with you, Tessa, in the next.
Thank you very much. That would be nice. That's right. Has anyone got a larger majority than you?
I think in terms of numbers, yes. I think if I'm correct, Munira in Vince's constituency in Twickenham has got a more sort of in numbers a higher majority, but not in percentages, because Bath is quite a small constituency, and in fact with boundary changes it will change. I'll become a bigger constituency geographically.
Okay, good. This is a comment which I think you may want to just note. And that is Rosie, our president, said, I'd like to know why Priti Patel is all worked up about a statue rather than the several police officers who were injured, some seriously, in London. It's just an observation.
I would say she has talked this afternoon in the statement. If you want to watch it again on BBC Parliament, if you're that interested. I mean, some people are interested, but some people don't watch these things again. The statement today was very much about that frontline police officers have put themselves out there to protect the public. They're doing an excellent job. She has mentioned them, and it is of course unacceptable that police officers get injured. And I have to say, even the Somerset Police has acted incredibly well through the COVID crisis, and even the Police and Crime Commissioner, I don't like to praise her too much until I see my police station delivered back in Bath. But she's actually been very much in touch. policing has been by consent. I think that's the best way forward. And the Avon and Somerset Police Force has definitely acted on those principles. And when police officers do get hurt, it is unacceptable. And, you know, our thoughts and our best wishes for their full recovery is obviously going out from everybody.
Sure. Second to last question. Peter Lawrence asked a question earlier, but he just said, Ed Davey, when he came to speak to us, or he didn't come, but when he spoke to us, talked of the power of local people writing to local papers. Do you agree that everyone on this call should write at least four letters a year to local papers?
Obviously, in a leadership context, I shouldn't agree with my opponents, but on this one, it's a no-brainer. People read the front pages, the sport pages, and the letter pages. So yeah, absolutely. And I can write into the papers and make press releases as long as, you know, for a long time. But what papers really take is the voice of local people, and other people read what other people have to say. Because very quickly they'll say, oh, Wera, yeah, she would say that, wouldn't she? But if you're saying something, it's so much more powerful. And we have been encouraging our local members to write into the papers, into the letter pages. It makes a difference. Do it. Comment on any platform that you have, be that, you know, the physical press, you know, your print press, or be that social media platforms. It matters. Go for it.
Brilliant. Thank you. The last question is from Philip Evis. Philip has been agent for many, many elections, and I thank him. His question is, are you related in any way to the former Liberal MP for Wells, Arthur Hobhouse?
Well, my husband is, and I think William refers to him as Great Uncle Arthur, which means I think he was a brother to William's grandfather, or my children's great-grandfather. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
I haven't met him.
Okay, I think your children are all grown up and busy doing their own thing, aren't they?
My children are all busy doing their own thing. I've got a son who does a PhD in Hong Kong, and he's very much aware of what's going on there politically. I've got a daughter who works in London, another daughter who had to come home from South Africa because she's lost her heart to South Africa. Emily Hobhouse is you know, obviously also a family member who is very much loved as a social a human rights campaigner in South Africa. And our Emily followed into the footsteps of the historic Emily and has really fallen in love with South Africa. She worked there, but she had to come back because of COVID. She's going to work on human rights and is intending, she did she studied at SOAS for international relations, but she's intending to go into human rights. And then I have another son who is interested in, or is working on the Middle East, and he is studying Arabic and Islamic studies. So my children are quite sort of spread out in the world. The last thing they do is come back to their mother in Bath, but I'm okay with that.
That's cool. That's brilliant. Wera, I want to say thank you so much for giving your time to everybody. There, I can see claps coming up all over the place.
Right, thank you.
That's all right, absolutely brilliant. To everybody who's on the call, I'm just going to say, those of you who are members, you will have a vote in the leadership election. Those of you who are our friends and are not members, you have the opportunity to join the party this month and the very first part of next month. And you're able then to vote in the leadership election. And the point of having these sessions with our leadership candidates is that you can see exactly what you're going to get, and that you can play your part in choosing our leader, which is great. I have to say that your next opportunity is to come and meet Layla Moran next Saturday at 11 o'clock. And I look forward to seeing all of you to return then. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you to Emily. And yes, I should remind you, the whole of this has been recorded, so there will be a recording available. And Emily, are you going to be able to put that up somewhere? You're muted.
Dear, and the team will send it to me, and I will let everyone know where they can access it.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for coming, all of you. Thank you again, Vera. It's absolutely.
Thank you to you, Tessa, for everything. And if I can make a last pitch, I've got a website, www.verahoppers.org.uk. I put a lot of the stuff that I believe in and I'm standing for on my website. So if you want to get even more, go onto my website. But thank you, everybody, for listening to me. Thanks, Tessa. That was great. That was fun. And I hope to see you soon again in the physical space.